I'm Tony DeMaria, the editor of JACC, here bringing you a highlight of the June 11th issue, or a couple highlights of the June 11th issue of the journal. And this first paper is really an interesting study, and it deals with the role of physical inactivity and specifically sitting as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And in this particular study, they took advantage of the database from the Women's Health Initiative observational study, over 70,000 women included, to determine whether or not the time spent sitting and the degree of physical activity in fact, in and of themselves, were risk factors for overall myocardial infarction and stroke. Not surprisingly, what they found was that women who were sitting for 10 hours a day clearly had an increased risk, small but definite, for these combined cardiac events. Importantly, if you looked at the group of women who were in the highest category for time sitting and in the lowest category for overall self-reported physical activity, the rate of cardiovascular events, MI and stroke, was highest in this group of individuals. Now, the first question, of course, is, well, perhaps the people who sit the most are those people who are in the poorest shape. But interestingly enough, there was no interaction between these two variables. It was found, however, that time spent sitting and low physical activity were most marked as risk factors in individuals who were overweight and in elderly women. Now, this study is very interesting, but it again points to many of the issues that are difficult in relating physical activity to cardiovascular risk. We don't know what these individuals were doing when they were sitting. And in fact, they may have been watching television, or perhaps they were busily working at some kind of occupation. And everything was self-reported. And intuitively, it does seem that individuals who are the most sedentary are perhaps sedentary because they have other comorbidities. Nevertheless, I think additional data supporting the fact that, number one, physical inactivity can be a risk factor, and number two, even in those individuals who sit for a long period of time, getting up and participating in some physical activity may be beneficial. We all know that cardio-oncology is attracting a lot of attention. Many of the most effective chemotherapeutic agents are cardiotoxic, and cardiotoxicity limits their utility in patients with cancer. And we also know that it would be of great value if we had some form of therapy that could reduce this cardiotoxicity. And we're forearmed with the knowledge that ACE inhibitors such as enalapril in small studies have been shown to be effective not only in prolonging survival and heart failure, but of being beneficial in animal models and some human pilot trials of chemotherapy with cardiotoxicity. The same is true of beta-adrenergic blockade with agents such as carvedilol. So a group of investigators from Spain set out to study whether a combination of enalapril and carvedilol given to patients without evidence of left ventricular dysfunction who had hematologic malignancies could effectively reduce cardiotoxicity. And their endpoint for cardiotoxicity was left ventricular ejection fraction, measured both by echocardiography and by cardiac magnetic resonance. And what they found was, in fact, this combination of enalapril and carvedilol given to these patients prophylactically was successful in maintaining left ventricular ejection fraction unchanged, whereas the control group of patients had a fall in their ejection fraction of about 3%, 3 to 3.5%. So not enormous, but an absolute 3 to 3.5%. Now, they also looked at composite clinical endpoints such as heart failure and death. And in these composite endpoints, what they observed was that there was a lesser number of adverse events in the patients who were in the treatment group as compared to the controls. So this is relatively exciting information. The information is limited to hematologic malignancies, and it's also clear that the patients who received the chemotherapeutic agents throughout received the most benefit. If patients went on to stem cell transplantation, then the benefit of the combined enalapril and carvedilol wasn't quite as good. And whenever one looks at death as an endpoint, one has to recognize that most patients die of infections and sepsis, and it's not clear that the prevention of cardiotoxicity can really make a major difference in that endpoint. Nevertheless, I think some potentially very exciting information about the ability to reduce cardiotoxicity in cancer patients. For JACC, I'm Tony DeMaria.